Good information is delivered on Wikisana. Are you already on Wikisana?
Dear viewers, welcome to today's show Visite. I am grateful for this format and would like to thank you at this point for all the valuable letters. One has reached me from Sabine here from Switzerland, and Sabine, you write in your email that with the whole topic of a new point of view on processes in our body have only recently made contact and are also grateful to be able to do this now. You are just coming back from a colonoscopy, which was recommended to you. You are in the second half of your 50s and all is well. You still have questions about what is really good or not good and would be grateful if I summarized important things for you on the subject of the intestine again. Why is the concern for the intestine so infinitely great? Let me explain that to you again, because the most important task that our intestine fulfills for us humans is that we understand that it is always the starting point for all processes that have a chance in our body at all. Now it's not always 100%, but to 99%. The root in the plant human is like in the tree, so hidden that we actually only grasp very little of the whole event. That is also the great cosmic intelligence that the intestine takes good care of itself in this responsibility, if it is well taken care of. And then we come to the first point right away. He takes care of the fine digestion. Fine digestion means that I have to prepare the nutrients that I absorb first. At the moment when they are ready for nutrients, i.e., split open by enzymes into broken pieces, finely chopped, it is possible for the body to act with it. Only then can and they can get into the blood or into the lymphs. So just swallowing a piece of food half chewed down doesn't mean that it is possible for the body to take the important things out of it. He has to do pre-work first. The bacteria are very important for the metabolism of fat. The synthesis of vitamins, especially the fat-soluble A, D and K and H, B, K and H, this way around, are very important. Our organism takes over B vitamins. Vitamin B12, for example, is formed by the coli bacteria. The whole regulation of the entire microbiome, the diversity of these bacterial strains, is self-organized. And 80% of them are lactic acid bacteria, bifidobacteria, lactobacillus and enterobacteria, which guard against pathological germs, disease-causing bacteria. That means that all of this is always in a good balance, because bacteria are what ensure our health. A term that we should also pronounce with a good feeling in the future. Bacteria are so alienated. Bacteria always have to be disturbed or destroyed. That's not true. Human life would not be possible without microorganisms, bacteria. The whole regulation takes place independently, and bacteria, viruses, parasites, All of this is kept in balance through the microflora and our intestinal immune system. The mucous membrane cells, the intestinal mucous membrane, which is the most important boundary between the inside and the outside, is the mucous membrane barrier, which is nourished by the bacteria. That means that we create short-chain fatty acids, or we create the bacteria, the short-chain fatty acids, through the ballast substances. But the mucous membrane barrier has to be protected. That means, if this mucous membrane barrier becomes defective, if these so-called cross-connections or mesh networks in the mucous membrane become porous, they are also called tie junctions. Then the permeability is disturbed. In many programs, we have always talked about permeability, about mucous membrane permeability. And this mucous membrane permeability would mean that what is allowed to be absorbed in our organism at all is reached uncontrollably. This is a situation that, as you are now behind yourself, Sabine, cannot assess in a colonoscopy, i.e. a colonoscopy, how the mucous membrane immunity is. There is also a clinical parameter for this, that is the secretory IgA. This shows us to what extent the mucous membrane immunity is intact, to what extent inflammation destroys this mucous membrane barrier. Clinical parameters, e.g., calprotectin or alpha-antitrypsin or EPX, are very often increased in food intolerances. The lifespan of individual intestinal cells is regulated and the growth is monitored by the intestine itself, by healthy microorganisms. If they are not there sufficiently, polyps can develop, the body capsules diverticulitis or tumors. One thing is not possible: adenocarcinomas cannot develop on an intact, healthy intestinal mucous membrane. All inflammatory processes precede a tumor. That is why tumor prevention is not a colonoscopy. This is a tumor search that can be done with the phrase, "We have not found anything." But one cannot say, "Your intestine is in a good balance, the mucous membrane is healthy." The macroscopic eye of the examiner does not produce this, it is too superficial. For this, a fecal sample is by far more profound. And what else do bacteria do? They regulate the gastric acid. The stomach is responsible for the digestion of protein and has a direct feedback to the small intestine. That is why it is so important that, within the framework of good and optimal stool regulation, one also has an indirect indication of how far the intestine is in balance. Now you can say, "Well, I go to the toilet every 2 or 3 times a day." That would be justified with 3 good meals a day. You have to be able to do that, because that is ultimately the first instance. If you have a high blood pressure or have rheumatic suffering or perhaps also an autoimmune condition, make sure that you have regular bowel movement. You don't even have to start before that. And also make a picture of whether you have an increased mucous membrane permeability or not. And clean your intestine. And please, not just once or twice, but really do a series of hydrocolon therapies. Maybe once a week for over 6 weeks. And enemas with coffee charcoal, with a little salt, with lemon. There are so many ways to use it. But help to relieve the intestine. Especially in the crypts of the intestine, so many fecal stones and material can accumulate, which, of course, often remains for weeks, months, and even years. And thus indirectly damage the intestinal mucous membrane. I would always build up the intestine again after a good intestinal cleaning. And if you build up the intestine again, then of course you also have to know what the mucous membrane immunity is like. How can I strengthen the microenvironment? And one must never be left out. These are the lactic acid bacteria. And from Anna Katerina Schock, you have already noticed a lot about your loving relationship to the microorganisms in us. But this large microbial intestine, in its powerful strength, is already 50% health retention. That is why the effective microorganisms are the soil aids. That means that the whole microbiome can quietly strengthen and build up again. This dextrorotatory lactic acid is produced more closely by these lactic acid bacteria. And it has a great influence on the flow property of blood and on many processes. And it ensures that we have a very milky, acidic intestinal environment, especially in the large intestine. This is where most microorganisms are settled. The thin intestine has a very high antibacterial function, just like the stomach. The stomach is really very acidic. The stomach pH value has a very deep, acidic range of 1 to 4. There is also an almost neutral pH value environment increased in the mucous membranes. Due to the food, it can sometimes puff up to 4. But it has to preserve the acid, because it is the one that makes it very difficult for viruses, bacteria, fungi, parasites to get into the human organism at all. And that is why the acidity of the acid is of crucial importance here. And the gastrointestinal cells produce it. The small intestine contains enzymes, the lysozyme or also the defensin. And all of this helps to split up the food well and also to build up the mucous membrane immunity well. Remember when you eat that you eat very, very consciously. I don't want to say slowly. What is slow? That is relative. But to eat consciously means to be aware that the plate is full. That also has a bit to do with the feeling that I can be very grateful for it. And if I now consciously eat what I eat, then it is many, many times already predigested by my saliva. That means the stomach actually doesn't have much digestion anymore. It is responsible for splitting up the protein into the amino acids. But the entire digestion process is already predigested by the mucous membrane or by the saliva of the mouth. And then it gets into the stomach through the esophagus tube. If this process can really take place slowly, if the chyme is almost liquid, then you have a very conscious interaction with the gastric acid. These are always the questions. Too much gastric acid. Why do you sometimes have too much gastric acid? Why is pantazole, one of the most commonly sold drugs, now freely available? It's not good to just freeze the stomach in a basic environment. Then it can do its antimicrobial, antiparasitic, and antiviral tasks for you no longer. And you shift an infectious event one floor down. All the good bacteria that now prevail in the stomach and the pancreas, above all, not only demand peptides, i.e., protein digestion, but they also promote sufficient mucus formation. And these cup cells or these mucus-forming cells, these column cells, are now the ones that give the corresponding peristaltics to the whole digestion process and dissolve the food, in the truest sense of the word. They are all in connection with the mucous membrane cells. And this activity of these cells is incredibly important. Who and what and, above all, how we take it with us. Do you actually know what damages our whole, what damages our stomach and pancreas the most? Things that are directed against life. Anti means against and bias means life. These are antibiotics. They significantly destroy the intestinal walls, the intestinal bacteria that settle here, the villi. This causes a disrupted nutrient absorption and it slowly becomes a lack of settlement. Clostridium, Klebsiella, and many highly pathological pathogens, some of which form histamines, can suppress the healthy flora. There are a number of painkillers that irritate the mucous membranes today, such as aspirin or non-steroidal antirheumatic agents, such as diclofenac, ibuprofen. There is a lot of intolerance. You know that. You can hardly metabolize the grain through gluten. But there is also fructose and lactose intolerance. We actually see today that a lot more has already contributed to this in the background. It can be a highly amalgamated, burdened saliva for 10 to 20 years that I have swallowed down again and again. It contains, for example, mercury or zinc. It can also be parasitic burdens. A topic that we have already discussed very often is that we should at least once a year carry out the removal of a parasitic biofilm in the entire gastrointestinal tract for one of the most important measures. If you are a dog or cat owner, you are very welcome to do it twice. This can strengthen the immune balance and thus lower the inflammatory activity. And you are ahead of a worse consumption of food. That means, if the intestinal mucous membrane is open, if it is inflamed, if a lack of inhabitation widens, then of course the nutrient intake is also lower. Some people often say, I can take what I want. Nevertheless, I have the feeling that my intestine does not absorb the things. This is when the intestine, due to this lack of inhabitation or inflammation, is not able to regenerate, then comes to these digestive disorders. Then it is really time to relieve it. And if you remove a biofilm like that, then it can take 4, 5, sometimes even 6 days. But restoring an intestinal health is actually not dramatic. You just have to take care of the relief first. And in the meantime, I also recommend parasitic diagnostics so that you know what you are talking about. Because parasites will not give up their environment at all. When you re-establish the intestine, you think of a very high fiber food, i.e. a lot of fiber-rich fruit, vegetables, sweet potatoes, also raw vegetables to eat. And then you leave everything out that means sweet. Like a tornado, the need for fungal strains increases. You can only starve them out a bit by reducing the carbohydrates and, above all, the fast carbohydrates, the sweet. No ready-made products and, above all, no fructose and no artificially produced fructose syrups. And what I have actually observed in recent years, it makes a lot of sense to take gluten out of the diet. Gluten has a very high level of inflammation, which is responsible, and almost only after 4 to 70 hours. That means, if you want to bring peace and quiet into the whole process, then you should also be ready once, over a period of about 4 to 6 weeks. With a very gentle, very alkaline basic diet, to ensure a new microenvironment here. To actually just give up on the old doesn't make any sense at all. First you have to get rid of the burden and then I can build up. Do you always think of phospholipids? Phospholipids contained in the egg yolk. Phospholipids are those that reinforce the cell membrane and the cell can communicate well again. The pathological or the changed cell receptors that are confronted with the environment and communicate, to rebuild them, to make a cell wall smoothly available for cell exchange. That's why the term metabolism. The cell membrane is the most important place where substances change between intra- and extracellular. A lot of flea seeds, so rich in dietary fiber. Plant oils such as algae oils or also linseed oil, which is high in omega-3. This is a situation that I think will save you a lot of things at once. My observation is, if I am consistent with this and I don't know a tumor patient or a rheumatist or a patient with an autoimmune disease who hasn't been in any form here for a long time, only the few exceptions tell me that I have a very well-functioning bowel movement and yet we find an imbalance in the test of the microbiome. There are actually always very fruitful and interesting indications to create a balance here. And it's just worth investing in it. And I hope I was able to explain to you with these little, once again related tips, the importance of such a measure, how important it is to get involved and to ensure a good balance. And above all, to never give up on the belief that everything was fine with the intestine, just because you find a very non-pathological intestinal mucosa purely macroscopically. Yes, that's a summary, dear Sabine. From my side a medical advice, from my side a little tip. We are all adults, at least the viewers of this visitation program. Do you actually like to swing, or do you actually always pass such a swing? Leave it to the children. Our balance organ has to be moved and adapted well and again and again. And for that, the swing is a very nice training, apart from the fact that it is of course also a measure that brings joy, that brings lightness. But just from the aspect of movement. To stimulate the lymph fluid within our balance organ again and again, also means to stimulate the blood circulation and microcirculation in this area. So if you dare and dare, I always dare, then you should, when you go to play with your children or grandchildren or see a playground or in the garden. Just put up a swing and swing into the sky. In this sense, I wish you a lot of joy. I look forward to the next visitation program with you. I am also looking forward to the registrations at Visite-at-QS24 TV, and I'll stay with the best regards until next week. Goodbye.